The envelope arrived on the day of Raymond Rockwell's funeral, and inside were 6 words that would change everything. "You'll need this more than she." I stared at the plane ticket to Rome, my hands trembling not from grief, but from the sudden understanding that my wife's grandfather had just handed me either salvation or damnation. My name is Evan Kincaid, and until that moment, I was nothing more than a public school history teacher married to Boston's newest heiress. Clarissa Rockwell had always been out of my league. Elegant, sharp-tongued, and born into the kind of old money that makes people bow their heads in reverence. But Raymond had seen something in me that his granddaughter never did. He'd seen a man worth saving. The funeral was a spectacle of wealth and false mourning. Clarissa stood at the center of it all, draped in designer black, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of someone who'd been preparing for this inheritance her entire life. The reading of the will had been a public humiliation for me. She received the penthouse, the yacht, the $27 million company, while I got a single plane ticket and the snickers of her social circle. "Maybe you'll find yourself in Rome," Clarissa had said in the limo afterward, her voice dripping with condescension. "God knows you've been lost here." But it was in that same limo that I noticed Blake Alden's hand lingering too long on her back, saw her phone lighting up with messages signed B.A. Blake was her lawyer, her legal counsel, and apparently much more. The affair wasn't even subtle. They were practically flaunting it in front of everyone, secure in the knowledge that poor, pathetic Evan would never have the backbone to do anything about it. That's when Fiona, Clarissa's best friend and chief gossip distributor, leaned over with her shark's smile. "The will was rewritten for a reason, you know," she whispered, loud enough for half the limo to hear. "Clarissa's Rome arrangements are quite the joke around town." I took the ticket, not because I wanted a trip, but because I wanted answers. Or maybe revenge. Rome hit me like a fever dream. The ancient stones seemed to whisper secrets as I navigated the crowded streets, following the driver who'd met me at the airport with a simple sign, "Mr. Kincaid." He was a quiet man with knowing eyes who spoke only to give directions, leading me through winding alleyways to a building that looked like it had been crumbling since the Renaissance. The law office of Vittorio De Luca was hidden on the 3rd floor, behind a door marked only with a brass nameplate green with age. Vittorio himself was a man who seemed carved from the same ancient stone as the city, weathered, enduring, and full of secrets. "Mr. Kincaid," he said in accented English, gesturing to a leather chair that had probably seen Napoleon. "Your grandfather-in-law was a very wise man, also very angry man, when he discovered what his granddaughter had been doing." He slid a folder across the mahogany desk. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. Evidence of Clarissa's financial fraud, Blake's illegal manipulation of company funds, and most importantly, a power of attorney that Raymond had secretly executed, giving me control over key aspects of the Rockwell empire. "He knew about the affair," Vittorio continued, pouring 2 glasses of wine that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "He knew about the stealing. He knew they were planning to frame you for unhinged behavior, to remove you completely from the picture." The wine turned to ash in my mouth. Why didn't he just cut her off entirely? Vittorio's smile was sharp as a blade. "Because he wanted you to have the choice. You can walk away, take your dignity and start fresh, or," he gestured to the documents, "you can burn them to the ground." I stared at the papers, my mind racing. Power of attorney, proxy votes, evidence of fraud. I'd been handed a flamethrower, and suddenly the idea of using it seemed very, very tempting. That's when Vittorio showed me the security footage from the hotel across the street. There, in grainy black and white, was my wife of 8 years locked in a passionate embrace with Blake Alden, in Rome. They hadn't even waited for me to leave the country before flaunting their affair on an international stage. Power of attorney? I could ruin her, and suddenly I wanted to. I returned to Boston 3 days early, my luggage light but my pockets heavy with ammunition. The penthouse garage was dimly lit as I made my way to the parking spaces, and there it was, Blake's silver BMW, sitting pretty in the spot that used to be mine. He'd strut in, but he'd crawl out, that's a promise. I worked quickly and quietly. The distributor cap came off easily, a trick I'd learned from my father, who'd been a mechanic before he died. I let the air out of all 4 tires, not enough to be dangerous, just enough to be humiliating. Then I slipped upstairs to the penthouse that had never really felt like home. Blake's jacket hung on the back of my kitchen chair, expensive Italian wool that probably cost more than I made in a month. I dusted it liberally with itching powder I'd picked up at a novelty shop. paying special attention to the collar and cuffs. Let him scratch himself raw during his next court appearance. I was sitting in the living room, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper, when Clarissa walked in. She looked radiant, glowing with the kind of satisfaction that comes from getting everything you've ever wanted. Her smile faltered when she saw me. "Evan? You're back early. How was Rome?" "Educational," I replied, not looking up from the sports section. "How was Boston? The food? The lawyer in your bed?" The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. But Clarissa Rockwell was made of sterner stuff than that. Within seconds, she'd recovered, slipping into the gaslighting routine she'd perfected over our 8-year marriage. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steady, but her hands shaking. "You're being paranoid again, Evan. Maybe you should see Dr. Morrison about adjusting your medication." I'd never been on medication, but that was classic Clarissa. Plant the seed of doubt, make everyone question my sanity. It had worked for years, but not anymore. "Blake's car won't start," I said conversationally. "Funny thing about those foreign engines, so temperamental. He might want to call a cab." Her eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" "Me? I'm just a poor delusional schoolteacher, remember? What could I possibly do to someone as powerful and connected as Blake Alden?" The sound of cursing from the garage drifted up through the floor. Blake had discovered his car troubles. I smiled and turned the page of my newspaper. "You're different," Clarissa said, studying me with the intensity of a scientist examining a new species. "Rome changed you. Maybe it did, or maybe it just reminded me who I used to be." That afternoon, I drove to Jefferson High School, where I'd been teaching American history for the past 12 years. The building was old and underfunded, a far cry from the private academies where Clarissa's friends sent their children. But it was honest work with honest people. Mr. Walsh, the headmaster, was in his office grading papers when I knocked. He was 73 years old, sharp as a tack, and one of the few people who'd never been impressed by my wife's money or social standing. "Evan," he said, looking up over his reading glasses, "you look like a man with something on his mind." I told him everything. The affair, the fraud, the power of attorney, the evidence Vittorio had shown me. Mr. Walsh listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small notes on a legal pad. "She's been calling here," he said when I finished. "Your wife, asking questions about your mental state, your behavior, whether you've been acting erratically." I told her that in 30 years of education, I'd never met a more stable, reliable teacher. My blood ran cold. "She's building a case. She's trying to. But it won't work, son. Too many people here know your character. The question is, what are you going to do with this information?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message from Miss Baines, Raymond's former housekeeper, and the one person in Clarissa's circle who'd always treated me with kindness. The message contained a video file and 3 words: "You need this." The video was grainy, clearly shot from a hidden camera, but the audio was crystal clear. Clarissa and Blake, in what looked like his law office, discussing their plans to have me committed for psychiatric evaluation, to challenge Raymond's will on the grounds that he'd been manipulated by his unstable grandson-in-law. Once Evan's out of the picture, Blake's voice came through my phone speaker. "We can restructure everything. The company, the assets, everything goes to you, and through you, to us." "What about the Rome trip?" Clarissa asked. "Perfect. We'll say he came back ranting about conspiracies and secret documents. Classic paranoid behavior. Dr. Morrison owes me a favor. He'll sign the commitment papers." I stared at the phone screen, my hands shaking with rage. They weren't just stealing from me. They were planning to destroy my sanity, my reputation, my entire life. Mr. Walsh reached across the desk and squeezed my shoulder. "Sometimes, son, the only way to win is to change the game." The Rockwell Company headquarters occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown Boston high-rise. I'd been there exactly twice in 8 years of marriage. Once for the Christmas party, once for Raymond's retirement celebration. Both times, I'd felt like an imposter in a borrowed suit, smiling and nodding while Clarissa's business associates made small talk and wondered what she was doing with a public school teacher. Today, I walked through those marble-floored lobbies like I owned the place, because, according to the documents in my briefcase, I essentially did. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a smile that could cut glass, looked up as I approached. "Mr. Kincaid, we weren't expecting you today." "Emergency board meeting," I said, my voice carrying the kind of authority I'd never known I possessed. "I'll need the conference room in 10 minutes, and I want all department heads present." "Of course, sir. Should I call Mrs. Rockwell?" "That won't be necessary." The power of attorney Raymond had left me was comprehensive and legally airtight. With it, I could freeze accounts, call meetings, and exercise proxy votes on behalf of the Rockwell estate. Clarissa might have inherited the company, but she'd inherited it with strings attached. Strings that were now wrapped firmly around my fingers. The department heads filed into the conference room, looking confused and slightly concerned. These were serious people, accountants, lawyers, marketing executives, who'd built their careers on the Rockwell name and reputation. They deserved to know what kind of people they were really working for. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, standing at the head of the polished conference table, "I've called this meeting to discuss some irregularities that have come to my attention regarding company finances and management decisions." I laid out the evidence methodically, professionally. The diverted funds, the falsified reports, the shell companies Blake had set up to siphon money from legitimate accounts. I didn't mention the affair, that was personal. But the financial fraud was business, and these people understood business. The room grew quieter with each revelation. By the time I finished, you could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. "What are you proposing?" asked Janet Morrison, the chief financial officer and a woman who'd worked for Raymond for over 20 years. "Immediate freeze on all discretionary accounts, pending a full audit. Suspension of Blake Alden's access to company funds and facilities, and a vote of no confidence in current management." "You can't do this," came a voice from the doorway. Blake Alden stood there, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face flushed with anger and scratching. He couldn't seem to stop scratching his neck and wrists. "This is corporate mutiny. This is corporate responsibility," I replied calmly. "And according to the power of attorney executed by Raymond Rockwell, I absolutely can do this." Blake stepped into the room, his lawyer's instincts kicking in despite his obvious discomfort. "That document is invalid. Raymond wasn't in his right mind when he signed it." "Are you saying Raymond Rockwell, one of Boston's most respected businessmen, was mentally incompetent when he executed these documents?" Janet asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Because that's a very serious accusation, Mr. Alden." Blake realized his mistake immediately. Attacking Raymond's mental capacity would invalidate not just my power of attorney, but potentially Clarissa's inheritance as well. He was trapped, and he knew it. "The board will hear about this," he said, backing toward the door. "The board is hearing about it," I replied, "right now. In fact, why don't we take that vote?" The motion passed unanimously. Blake Alden was stripped of his access to company funds and facilities, effective immediately. Security escorted him from the building while he was still scratching himself raw. That evening, I sat in Murphy's Tavern, a working-class bar 3 blocks from the school where teachers and city workers went to decompress after long days. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name and nobody cared about your bank account. I was nursing my second beer when my phone rang. "You bastard!" Clarissa's voice was pure venom. "What did you do?" "I exercised my legal rights as proxy holder for the Rockwell estate," I said, loud enough for the other patrons to hear. "Is there a problem with that?" "You know damn well what the problem is. Blake can't access the accounts. The board is asking questions, and half the company thinks I'm embezzling funds." "Are you?" The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Finally she spoke, her voice low and dangerous. "This isn't over, Evan. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Actually, I do. I'm dealing with a cheating wife and her corrupt boyfriend who thought they could steal from me and have me committed to cover their tracks. How's that for understanding the situation?" I hung up and ordered another beer. Around me, the bar's regular customers, teachers, firefighters, construction workers, went about their evening routines, unaware that I'd just fired the first shot in a war that would reshape one of Boston's oldest family fortunes. My phone buzzed with a text from Miss Baines. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow. Clarissa's calling in favors. Be ready." Ugh, the queen is dead. Long live the villain. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 a.m. sharp in the Rockwell Company's executive conference room. I arrived early, my briefcase loaded with documents, and my mind focused on the battle ahead. The board members filed in, one by one. Old money Boston, every one of them. People who'd known Raymond for decades and had watched Clarissa grow up in the shadow of his empire. Clarissa arrived precisely on time, flanked by 2 lawyers I didn't recognize, and wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. She looked composed, professional, every inch the grieving granddaughter and rightful heir. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands, as she arranged her papers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. "I've called this meeting to address the unauthorized actions taken by my husband, actions that threaten the stability and reputation of this company." And she was good, I had to give her that. She painted me as an unstable, jealous spouse who was lashing out after being excluded from the inheritance. She questioned my mental state, my motives, my right to exercise the power of attorney that her grandfather had left me. "Evan has been under tremendous stress," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "The loss of my grandfather, the disappointment of not being included in the will in the way he expected. I think we can all understand how that might affect someone's judgment." The board members nodded sympathetically. These were people who'd known me only as Clarissa's quiet, unremarkable husband, the teacher who stood in the corner at company parties, nursing a single drink and counting the minutes until he could go home. When she finished, the room was quiet. All eyes turned to me, and I could see the doubt in their faces. Why should they trust the word of a public school teacher over Boston royalty? I stood slowly, deliberately, and walked to the head of the table. "Mrs. Rockwell paints a compelling picture," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room. "A grieving widow, concerned about her unstable husband's erratic behavior. It's almost believable." I opened my briefcase and began laying out documents, bank statements, transfer records, email printouts, photographs. Unfortunately for Mrs. Rockwell, the evidence tells a different story. The first document showed a transfer of $200,000 from the company's discretionary fund to a shell corporation registered in Blake Alden's name. The second showed that same money being funneled into a personal account shared by Blake and Clarissa. The third was a photograph of them together in Rome, taken by the hotel's security camera. This is what grief looks like, ladies and gentlemen. My wife was so devastated by her grandfather's death that she flew to Rome with her lover to celebrate their successful fraud scheme. The room erupted. Board members passed documents back and forth, their voices rising in anger and disbelief. Clarissa's face had gone white, but she rallied quickly. "These documents are fabricated," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior I was talking about. Evan is having a breakdown." "Then you won't mind if we call Blake Alden to verify these transactions," said Harold Pembroke, the board's senior member and one of Raymond's oldest friends. "Blake is unavailable," one of Clarissa's lawyers interjected. "Unavailable or hiding?" I asked. "Because I have security footage of him fleeing the building yesterday after being confronted with evidence of his embezzlement. I played the video on my laptop." The sound of Blake's cursing and threats echoing through the conference room as security escorted him out. The board members watched in stunned silence as Boston's most respected corporate attorney scratched himself like a flea-bitten dog while screaming about lawsuits and revenge. "The power of attorney executed by Raymond Rockwell is valid and legally binding," I continued. "I've exercised it to protect this company from further fraud and embezzlement. The question now is whether this board will stand behind Raymond's wishes or continue to enable the people who were stealing from him." The vote wasn't even close. Clarissa was removed as CEO, pending a full investigation into the company's finances. Her access to corporate accounts was frozen, her company credit cards canceled, her parking space reassigned. She stood slowly, her composure finally cracking. "This isn't over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started." "I started nothing," I replied. "I'm just finishing what you began." As she gathered her papers with shaking hands, Harold Pembroke cleared his throat. "Mrs. Rockwell, the board will need your company car keys, building access card, and any other corporate property in your possession." The humiliation was complete. Clarissa Rockwell, Boston's newest heiress, was being stripped of everything in front of the same people who'd been kissing her feet just hours earlier. She handed over the keys and cards without a word, then walked out of the conference room with as much dignity as she could muster. I watched her go, feeling no satisfaction, no triumph, just a cold, hard certainty that this was only the beginning. That evening I returned to Murphy's Tavern, but this time I wasn't alone. Word had spread quickly through Boston's interconnected social circles. Teachers, city workers, small business owners, all the people who'd been looked down on by Clarissa and her crowd for years. They bought me drinks, slapped me on the back, and shared their own stories of being dismissed and condescended to by Boston's elite. "Always knew there was something off about that woman," said Tommy Martinez, a construction foreman who'd done work on the Rockwell estate. "Too perfect, you know, like she was acting a part." "The way she talked to the staff," added Maria Santos, who'd waitressed at several high society events. "Like we were furniture, invisible until she needed something." As the evening wore on, more stories emerged. Clarissa's pattern of manipulation, her history of using people and discarding them, her complete lack of empathy for anyone she considered beneath her station. These people had been watching, remembering, waiting for someone to finally stand up to Boston's untouchable princess. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Nice work today, but she's not finished. Neither is Blake. Watch your back, a friend." I looked around the bar at the faces of working-class Boston. Teachers, firefighters, construction workers, nurses, people who worked honest jobs for honest pay and had no patience for the games played by the wealthy elite. These were my people, my allies in the war that was coming. Some men build empires. I was about to burn one to the ground. The construction site on the South Boston waterfront was a maze of steel beams, concrete forms, and heavy machinery. It was past midnight, and the place should have been deserted, except for the security guards making their rounds. But I'd received a tip from Tommy Martinez that Blake had been seen lurking around the site where his construction company was building luxury condos that were probably financed with stolen Rockwell money. I parked my car 2 blocks away and approached on foot, my breath visible in the cold November air. The site was dark except for the security lights casting long shadows between the skeletal frames of unfinished buildings. I could hear the harbor lapping against the nearby docks and the distant hum of late-night traffic. That's when I saw him, Blake Alden, dressed in dark clothes and carrying what looked like a crowbar, making his way toward a row of parked vehicles. My car was among them. The bastard was planning to vandalize my property, probably hoping to provoke me into doing something stupid that would support Clarissa's claims about my mental instability. I followed him through the construction site, staying in the shadows, watching as he approached my 10-year-old Honda Civic with obvious disdain. He raised the crowbar, preparing to smash the windshield, when I stepped out of the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Blake." He spun around, the crowbar still raised, his eyes wild with desperation and rage. Up close, I could see that he looked terrible, unshaven, hollow-eyed, his expensive clothes wrinkled and stained. The mighty had fallen far and fast. "You," he snarled, "you destroyed everything. My practice, my reputation, my future. You destroyed yourself," I replied, keeping my distance, but ready to move if he swung that crowbar. "I just provided the evidence. Evidence you fabricated. Documents you forged. Nobody steals from the Rockwells and gets away with it." He lunged at me with the crowbar. But desperation had made him clumsy. I sidestepped easily, and his momentum carried him into a stack of steel pipes. The crowbar went flying, clattering across the concrete and disappearing into the darkness. Blake scrambled to his feet, breathing hard. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but Clarissa has friends, connections, people who owe her favors." "Had," I corrected. "She had friends, past tense. Amazing how quickly people forget your name when the money disappears." I started walking toward him, and he backed away, suddenly realizing that he was alone in a dark construction site with a man he'd tried to destroy. The predator had become the prey. "You want to know the funny thing about bullies, Blake?" I continued, still advancing slowly. "They're always cowards underneath. Take away their power, their money, their protection, and what's left? Nothing but a scared little boy throwing a tantrum." His back hit a shipping container, and he had nowhere left to run. I grabbed him by his expensive shirt and slammed him against the metal wall, the sound echoing through the empty construction site. "You ever come near me again," I said, my voice low and dangerous, "or my property, or my workplace, and I'll make sure those videos of you and Clarissa hit every law firm in Boston. Your career is already over, but I can make sure you never work again anywhere." I reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. Genuine leather, probably cost more than I made in a week. I opened it and started pulling out credit cards, business cards, his driver's license. "What are you doing?" he gasped. "Taking trophies," I said, tossing his American Express card into a nearby cement mixer. "Consider it payment for emotional damages." One by one, I destroyed the symbols of his wealth and status. Credit cards went into the cement mixer. Business cards were scattered to the wind. His expensive watch ended up in a puddle of muddy water. Finally, I ripped his shirt, Italian silk, probably cost more than my car, and poured a bag of cement dust over his head. Blake stood there, covered in gray powder, looking like a ghost of his former self. "You're insane," he whispered. "No," I replied. "I'm just done being your victim." I walked away, leaving him alone in the darkness, with nothing but his humiliation and the long walk back to whatever hole he was hiding in. Behind me, I could hear him coughing and cursing, but I didn't look back. Some people needed to learn their lessons the hard way. The next morning, I was grading papers in my classroom when Mr. Walsh knocked on the door. He looked unusually serious, even for him. "Evan, we need to talk. Blake Alden filed a police report last night. Claims you assaulted him at a construction site." My heart sank. Had I gone too far? Had I given them the ammunition they needed to paint me as unstable and dangerous? "However," Mr. Walsh continued, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "the security cameras at the site tell a different story. They show Mr. Alden attempting to vandalize your car with a crowbar, then attacking you when you confronted him. Self-defense is perfectly legal in Massachusetts." Relief flooded through me. What about his allegations? Hard to take seriously when the man filing the report is covered in cement dust and missing his wallet. The police are treating it as a case of attempted vandalism and assault against you. That afternoon, I received a call from Harold Pembroke. The board had completed its preliminary investigation into the company's finances. The evidence of fraud and embezzlement was overwhelming, and they were turning everything over to federal prosecutors. Blake would likely face criminal charges, and Clarissa's inheritance would be tied up in legal proceedings for years. "There's something else," Harold said. "We found evidence that Raymond knew about the fraud months before he died. He'd been building a case against them, gathering evidence. That power of attorney wasn't just about giving you control. It was about giving you the tools to finish what he started." Raymond Rockwell had been playing a long game, setting up his unfaithful granddaughter and her corrupt lover for a fall that would echo through Boston's social circles for decades. And he'd chosen me, the quiet, unremarkable schoolteacher, to deliver the final blow. That evening, I sat in my empty apartment. Clarissa had moved out, taking only what she could prove was hers, reading the newspaper coverage of the scandal. The headlines were brutal. "Rockwell heiress accused of fraud. Boston lawyer faces federal charges. Family fortune built on stolen money." But it was the society page that really caught my attention. There, buried in the gossip column, was a small item about Clarissa Rockwell being asked to leave the Beacon Hill Country Club after her membership fees bounced. The queen of Boston society couldn't even afford her club dues. My phone rang. It was Clarissa. "Are you satisfied now?" she asked, her voice hollow and defeated. "Not yet," I replied, "but we're getting there. What do you want from me, Evan? What will it take for this to end?" I thought about that question for a long moment. What did I want? Justice? Revenge? Or just the simple satisfaction of watching a bully finally face consequences for her actions? "I want you to understand what it feels like," I said finally. "To be powerless, to be dismissed, to have people look right through you like you don't matter. I want you to know what it's like to be me." Wilhelm Buard. She hung up without another word. The final confrontation came 3 days later, in Boston Common, on a crisp Sunday morning. I was walking through the park, enjoying the autumn leaves and the peaceful silence, when I saw her sitting on a bench near the pond. She looked small, diminished, nothing like the commanding presence who'd ruled Boston's social scene just weeks earlier. "Hello, Clarissa." "Oui, here." She looked up, and I was shocked by what I saw. Her face was gaunt, her eyes red-rimmed from crying or drinking or both. Her clothes, while still expensive, hung loose on her frame, as if she'd lost significant weight. "The penthouse is gone," she said without preamble. "Seized as part of the investigation. The yacht, too. Everything Raymond left me is tied up in legal proceedings that could take years to resolve." "I know. Blake's been arrested. Federal charges. His lawyer says he's looking at 10 to 15 years if convicted." "I know that too." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've won, Evan. Completely and totally. I have nothing left. No money, no friends, no future. Are you happy now?" I sat down beside her on the bench, studying her profile against the backdrop of the pond where children were feeding ducks with their parents. This woman had been my wife for 8 years. I'd loved her once, or thought I had. Maybe what I'd loved was the idea of her, the fantasy of being accepted into a world that had always been closed to people like me. "You know what the funny thing is?" I said. I never wanted to destroy you. I just wanted you to see me, to treat me like I mattered, like I was worth something more than contempt and pity. I did see you, she said quietly. That was the problem. I saw a good man who deserved better than what I could give him. So I pushed you away, treated you badly, hoping you'd leave and find someone who could love you the way you deserved. It was the first honest thing she'd said to me in years, and it hit me like a physical blow. So you cheated on me for my own good. Is that what you're saying? I'm saying I'm a coward who took the easy way out instead of having a difficult conversation. I'm saying I hurt you because I was too selfish and too scared to admit that I wasn't the person you thought I was. Around us, families were enjoying their Sunday in the park, children laughing, couples walking hand in hand. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of betrayal and revenge. The fraud was real, I said. The embezzlement was real. Whatever your reasons for the affair, you still stole from your grandfather's company. She nodded. Blake convinced me it was just borrowing, that we'd pay it back once we were married and had full control of the company. I knew it was wrong, but I told myself it would all work out in